Now let's turn to a question that might be troubling some of you. The name of our course is Philosophy 7200. That's probably not what's troubling you, but it's called The History of Philosophy, the Modern Philosophers, sometimes called The History of Modern Philosophy. Now, in your previous studies, you've certainly taken history courses. Most of you have not really studied philosophy, at least not academically. But with regard to your history courses, you get an idea of what is an historical question. For example, in an American history class or a European history class for that matter, you might ask the question, how did the United States get drawn into World War II? And an answer to that might be something about the Japanese attacking us at Pearl Harbor. Maybe you have another kind of explanation of the events that brought it about that our leaders made a decision. Now, if we're looking at the history of philosophy from the perspective of history of philosophy, not history of philosophy, you might be thinking about the history of ideas, the intellectual history, and questions that would fall under that would be, how did Descartes and Locke's views of knowledge influence the development of Leibniz's view, for example? Or you might ask how Descartes' views influenced Locke's views. And in those cases we're looking for what a standard historical explanation. What were the conditions that led to Leibniz adopting this kind of view, and how did he get there based on the influence of reading, let's say, Descartes, Leibniz? So you might even talk about where he was brought up. But that's the way historians would approach the history of philosophy. But when we're doing philosophy, or we're doing the history of philosophy, we're doing what was once called by a famous philosopher, Bernard Williams, what you might call history of philosophy. So these historical explanations of what influenced people, the times, etc., are less important, but rather you might, when you're looking at it from the philosophy perspective, the history of philosophy, you want to understand, how does Descartes attempt, or what is Descartes' attempt to refute skepticism, or how does Descartes attempt to refute skepticism? And when we're looking at that, we might say, what is Descartes' view of knowledge and how we gain it, and what are his reasons for adopting these views? So what we're really looking for is to clarify concepts and articulate, that is, explain clearly, the reasons that Descartes cites for the view that he has, the conclusion that he gets to. And another thing that we're going to ask that a historian is not concerned with is that, is Descartes' view, for example, on knowledge or on the mind-body problem, is the view correct? Is the reasoning that Descartes has for that conclusion good reasoning? So we're worried about truth or rationality, or sometimes both, when we're looking at philosophical questions. So the idea in a historical context, if we're trying to answer a historical question in the history of ideas, it could be how you could answer it by explaining how the way the person was brought up influenced him and got him thinking about certain things. There are certain events in his life that are going to be crucial to influencing the intellectual, the philosopher, the thinker. But in our course, we're not really concerned with how he came up with his ideas or what is it that got the ideas, but rather we want to understand what his answer is to the philosophical question, and how does he support, how does he justify, How does he rationalize his particular answer?